We have been watching, if you can believe it, you can see on the split screen there with me, just over 4 hours of testimony from the Kielburger brothers, Marc and Craig Kielburger, in front of the Finance Committee, what became at times very dense and very heated exchanges between opposition MPs in particular and those two brothers. They are the founders of the We charity. I just want to kind of bring to you or explain to you some of the things that are important to know about this story, and then also the main points that were made during those 4 hours. I promise I'll keep it short because we do have the power panel standing by to weigh in on everything that we just heard, but I do think it's important to try and sum up what they said. First of all, we know what this controversy, we've been talking about this controversy for a number of days. Essentially, the government made a decision to enter into an agreement, a contribution agreement with We Charity to run what would have been originally a $900 million program is what the government said. Now we found out about $500 million. They would have paid We $43.5 million to do that. After that agreement was announced, a lot of things came to light through the various reporting of Canadaland, of the Globe and Mail, of CBC, around connections between the Trudeau family, in particular the Prime Minister's mother and brother, who were paid by We to speak at various events since Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, as well as the Finance Minister, who has made trips with the charitable organization, and as well his daughter works for the organization. So all of that came to light. We and the government end up breaking off the contract, and we arrive here. We've heard from other people involved in this. We are expected to hear from the Prime Minister himself, who will testify before that very same committee on Thursday, along with his Chief of Staff. But today we heard from the two men behind this charity, which, if you have a kid in this country, you've heard of the We organization. They are very big. They run We Days. They also do things with respect to international development. Today, the main thesis put forward by the Kielburgers was that they were not in this to profit in any way, and that their relationship with Liberals is not overly cozy, that they didn't stand to gain from this agreement. In fact, the main point that they put forward was that because of the contribution agreement, the way in which it was set up, they would not make any profit from all of this, so that they would incur expenses, those would get billed back to the government, and that's it. So they didn't necessarily, the point they made at least, have a stake in the game. As I said, they also went to great lengths to say they didn't have a particularly cozy relationship with the Trudeaus in particular, or other members of the Liberal government. They used lots of examples of other endeavors with various politicians from various parties to try and make that point. I should point out that the opposition did not buy it. And at that juncture is where I want to bring in the power panel to weigh in on how this kind of all fits in to the greater narrative around this controversy. Joining us now from east to west, or from west to east, I should say, over in Vancouver, Shachi Kurl. She's the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute. Next to her, actually, I'll skip over a few provinces because you also see on your screen there Françoise Boivin, of course, former NDP MP and political commentator. She's with us from across the river in Gatineau. Over in Saskatoon, or near Saskatoon, former director of communications to Prime Minister Harper, now managing partner at Rubicon Strategy, Corey Tenike. And in Toronto, Tim Murphy, managing director at Macmillan Vantage. Hi, everybody. Great to see you.
You too.
It's exciting to be able to talk because we just listened to so many hours of testimony. Shachi, I'm actually going to start with you because you were with us yesterday. You have a real keen sense of how Canadians, to what degree they're paying attention and how they perceive this so far. I wanted to know from you, bottom line, based on what you heard, what you heard today, do you think it helped or hurt the government's case?
So there's the issue of the government, and then there's also the issue of we. And I know the producers are saying keep this tight. So we'll talk about the government. I don't think this has hurt the Trudeau government. I don't think it's helped the Trudeau government. You had 4 hours of Marc and Craig Kielburger on screen, getting into really, as you've talked about, dense testimony, the minutia of the way they're set up. This is too much for people who, unless you're super engaged, to really follow all those bouncing balls. This is now a Hydra-headed thing. It's like dodgeball, and all the dodgeballs are going at the same time. But what it does is it reinforces and it underscores, even if you're just keeping half an eyeball on this, that the two guys associated with this contract that's under scrutiny just spent 4 hours answering questions. And although they did seek to clarify the record on a number of fronts, although the main point that they wanted to get across is we weren't in this for us, we weren't doing this for profit, there was no big payoff for us, that may go some way to taking the temperature down. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you're still left with a story and a saga of a government and a charity that was really mutually benefiting from each other's star power. And ultimately, Canadians are going to have to judge whether that was an appropriate relationship and whether the decision to sole source the contract to this organization, even with its qualifications, was the right decision, given that really, I think there's been an establishment that both entities, government, the Trudeaus benefited from the Kielburger star power. The Kielburgers certainly did not hurt for having the Trudeaus show up at their event.
Yeah, there were some interesting points, Tim, or details that the brothers released on that too, on both sides almost. First, when it comes to Margaret Trudeau, the Prime Minister's mother, that first of all, that she was paid not for speaking at We Day events, but that she was paid for the auxiliary events. And those events included things like fundraising or galas, things like that. So in a way, you could certainly see, for example, Charlie Angus look at, well, were you trying to leverage access there? On the flip side, there were, there was a great deal of detail provided by them about how they have not socialized with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister. They have not had lunches with he and his wife or anything like that. So they did try to, I think, make the point that they aren't, as I said at the beginning, as cozy as necessarily has been characterized. But I think Shachi has a point as well. Those questions are still going to persist, probably. What do you think?
Well, I mean, we're having a show about it, so I guess the questions are going to persist. But I think it's unsurprising to me that a charitable organization that's trying to attract, charitable donations and crowds for its purpose is looking to have people speak at events who have knowledge of areas they're concentrating in, mental health, for example, and are looking to people who've got some degree of fame in the country in which we're operating. So Margaret Trudeau is kind of a natural potential for that. I didn't get any sense out of this that the government was trying to, or they were trying to lever any special access to the government out of that. I think it was about generating support in the donor community and crowds. Some people are going to make allegations about it, but I don't think there's any fire there. I mean, obviously spending, I think the sad part, look, I don't know anything about We Charity, never met them, but it's kind of sad to watch people who we first met when they were teenagers doing major things, have been at 24 Sussex with, the Harpers, and have continued to have, talk to governments of all stripes, or watch what I think a lot of young people thought was a great organization having some real problems because of being dragged through the muck of this process without, frankly, there being much fire there.
I take your point on that. Corey, I'll get you to weigh in because your eyes were kind of bulging when Tim was talking. I would say there are some valid questions, though, just quickly about the way in which the charity had conducted itself. If you listen to the testimony prior, for example, from I do understand what you're saying, that they certainly are part, they're getting targeted very much in this, but some of the testimony from the chair of the board prior, who resigned because she says she couldn't get, they were laying off more than 100 people and she couldn't get any details of the finances of the company. But I do agree with Shachi. It's almost like that's one part of the issue. And then the other is what this did for what the government has put forward so far. And Corey, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's pretty rich to think that Margaret Trudeau is worth like $250,000 to do speaking at galas or whatever the stated purpose is. Now, I don't think they had a very good day testifying. I agree that it was pretty dense stuff at times, but I don't think they were well helped by smirking the whole time. I think they have had a very close relationship with Justin Trudeau and people closely associated with his administration. And I think they've profited from it. And whether it's profit in a technical sense of, what the fees, the $40-some million in fees are going towards, they've certainly done very well for themselves in attracting government dollars by playing this sort of game. It's not a very appropriate game, I think, in the eyes of a lot of Canadians. And I don't think it looks good on the Trudeau government.
The only point I make to you back on that is they did also talk about how, as a portion of the donations they get in. Like the grants from the previous government were a higher portion of that than this government. They did talk about all the other politicians from other parties that have been involved with them. Now, those politicians haven't necessarily decided to enter into a contribution agreement, so I take the point there. But even when it comes to Margaret Trudeau, she was on the lower end of speaking fees, they said as well. So and she was well known for advocacy around mental health. I think that's hard to dispute.
Yeah, certainly she has a reputation around that and has done work in that area for sure. But if you're, the old saying about that you must not only be virtuous, you must appear to be virtuous. And when you're having those kinds of arrangements for those amounts of money, and that is a very significant amount of money. Like I challenge your viewers back home to think how many of them are making $250,000 a year? Probably not very many. So it's quite a large amount of money, and I don't think it's appropriate. One of the things we've talked about before on this is I think the most inappropriate thing is the campaign style ads digital ads that We Charity was pumping out. They may have some relationships with other governments, but let's call a spade a spade. The Kielburgers are Liberals, and they have very close friendships with Liberals. These are ideological fellow travelers.
Do you think, Françoise, I want to bring you in. Do you think Tim's entertained by that? So we'll get a reaction later. Corey and Tim always entertained by each other during these panels, but
no one else is. So.
I'm always.
The show is for us.
Françoise, I did want to get you to weigh in as well. I guess on that central idea that and Corey spoke to it as well as Tim, but that they were extra, there was something about the relationship with the Liberals and this charity. That is central, I think, to what they tried to dispute during this testimony. I'm wondering if you think they were successful or unsuccessful in that.
Well, they were in my book, and I'm so neutral. They were pretty successful in a sense that, just remember, when we were all talking about great things about We Charity under all of its shape and form, everybody wanted to be associated with We Charity. I mean, they made a point of showing that the ex-Prime Minister Harper's wife was involved at some point in time. We know the wife from Peter MacKay, probably the next leader of the Conservatives, was involved. So that's what charity and big organization that collects funds are all about. They don't want Joe Blow from God knows what street that is not known by anybody. They want names that are going to be recognized and so on. So I thought they were pretty successful there. Did I learn much in that 4 hours? I learned that some of the MPs are rude as hell, and I'm not afraid to say it. Honestly, I might not be a Liberal no more, but you do not attack the right of Margaret Trudeau. You might say, hey, it's because of her name Trudeau that she was invited, but I thought those line of questionings were so cheap to try to hint that she had no credibility on the field. I felt bad for Margaret Trudeau for all the time that they were asking those questions. So that didn't bode well necessarily with the opposition. The lawyer side of me was appalled that they didn't go to the real point of those meetings, which is to know, what did the government do? Who did it? We already know that the Prime Minister and his Minister of Finance didn't recuse themselves. When the Kielburgers are saying that, they're heartbroken for the kids, they should be mad as hell at the government for really, really losing the ball at the goal line on such maybe a good project. And yes, it might be the kids who pay the price at the end of time. So I was surprised that the opposition didn't go more into the contract. Why was that organization deemed so brilliant by the civil servant? What was in that contract? Not necessarily just a little clause of salary payment and to the Kielburger, but the offer actually that they were going to offer to kids that they could create in exactly 24, 48 hours. There were so many line of questionings that would have made it not so much a kangaroo court, like somebody said on Twitter. It shouldn't have been.
Shachi, how do you think this sets up Thursday's testimony from the Prime Minister? Like, does it change your view of the significance of it, or how do you think it feeds into it?
So I think at best, again, this is all about sort of best case scenario, worst case scenario. Best case scenario, I think the lack of answers that Françoise has highlighted and the way some of the questions came out and really what we didn't learn from this continues to leave some questions as to, was this rushed? Was this either senior civil servants who by training and by definition are not, they're supposed to be the methodological process-driven folks. Were they all tripping over their feet to get this done very quickly? Why? What was going on behind that? Was it politicized? Was it politically driven? You've heard the Kielburgers say today that it wasn't them putting up their hands, which then puts the question squarely back on the Prime Minister around, well, what drove this decision? And again, was it about a motivation in and above the desire to get funds out to students to volunteer at a time of a great health pandemic? Was it also about just associating with a little bit of that magic sparkle dust that we carried and arguably maybe doesn't carry as much today? Or was there something else at play? So I think the questions for the Prime Minister, again, are really going to center on what was the motivation, who drove it, whose decision was it, and again, why did you, Prime Minister, and why did your Finance Minister not recuse yourselves from those discussions? That is, again, what it boils down to. In terms of the takeaways around We Charity, what we haven't talked about, and I'll just take a moment to say this, is really sort of the governance issues. We heard from Michelle Douglas this morning. Mm-hmm. We heard about her concerns. And, I think many of us on this panel are volunteer members of charities and not-for-profit boards. I am. I declare that openly, both with the Canadian Cancer Society nationally and with the Jack Webster Foundation in British Columbia. Part of what trustees and boards do are to take big contracts, big projects like this and go, okay, whoa, wait a minute. Is this North Star? Are we, crossing all of our T's and dotting all of our I's? Are we making sure everything's signed off and there's no gap so we don't run into problems like this? So it just sort of adds more to the murkiness and the muddiness and the mess of it all.
Yeah, I thought for me what jumped out in as far as that line of questioning goes, Tim, and I'll get your thoughts on it as well, is like it's another day of wondering how those questions weren't posed by the government when deciding to pursue this line of administering the program. Like there are clearly some bigger issues that the charity is dealing with. Why wasn't that considered when making the decision? I know they've said they were rushed and it was important, but that seems to kind of jump out.
Well, I think, look, I have no idea. You'll have to ask the bureaucrats why. I think, and they were up there, and I think they answered to the extent they could. I think, part of the context of what was going on during this time is relevant, and I think someone said, was it rushed? And I think the reality, the government was absolutely rushing to get aid out to Canadians across all spectrums. People were running into serious problems about being able to pay rent, buy food when they were sent home, and the government was trying to respond on a daily basis. So you had literally hundreds of billions of dollars of program design being done in days. And, both Corey and I have been around those tables, and normally it's not done that quickly. You start, you have a big policy process, and something that big is going to take a year or more. So, it's on one level unsurprising that some of these programs have run into glitches. And, sometimes the diligence probably that the bureaucrats would normally do didn't get done to the extent it should have. Maybe these questions would have been adequately answered. I don't know. Not my job to defend the We Charity. But I think at the end of the day, the casual casting of aspersions around this is appalling. I do think that the issue, the Prime Minister is going to have to answer is around his recusal. That's an appropriate political thing. The rest of it is just BS as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, I saw Corey's eyes jump out this time, so I'll get a final
good.
comment. I'll get a final comment from both Corey and Francoise. Corey, you first.
Well, look, I think the Morneau stuff should be pretty concerning too. If we're looking at areas where there's some pretty clear problems in judgment on the part of the government on the political side. I agree with the notion that there's nothing normal about pandemic planning and stuff that was going on in government, but the decision ultimately, how did it come forward? What did bureaucrats feel pressured because of the relationship with the Trudeaus? I don't know. I think all these things will come out in the fullness of time. And I think charity has got a lot of explaining to do, and I don't feel terribly bad for them. I think there's questions about governance. I think there's questions about appropriateness in their relationship with elected people who are in a position and do sometimes give them money. I wonder if that's something that they should have been doing, and if it will have a wider impact on how other charities behave in the future.
They sure like to talk about how many hours they were appearing before the committee for. Francoise, final word to you.
Yeah.
And mostly with whom they prepared, but that's an old lawyer's joke. Who were they in contact with? The Prime Minister better be ready, although he will have an easier job being there only for, an hour, with his presentation at the beginning and him playing around the concept of we and youth. He'll be in his element, and best defense is often the offense. So if the opponents are trying to muddy his mother or his wife, like the Kielburger were saying, they are somebody other than just the wife of or the mother of, and so on and so forth. So hopefully the opposition will be very oriented, and if they can leave aside the political game, it could be very interesting, because you nail it on the head, Vashi. The real question is, it was done very fast, maybe with a great objective, but more reason to know who in that office, in that Prime Minister's office, is in charge of making sure that all the check and balance, as fast as they can go, are done, especially when we're talking about a deficit that will be in the hundreds of billions of dollars. How many other contracts? That's the problem with people like me who are willing to give them, the benefit of the doubt, because you always presume people are in good faith, but to a certain point. So how many other contracts were just prepared at the corner of the table very quickly, and that at some point in time we'll discover more, and that is what is playing in the mind of people, and add to it the sexy facts of people being very into the charity and very involved in some commercials during election and so on. That gives you the perfect setup for a télé-réalité,
Well, it certainly will be interesting. Lots more to see when the Prime Minister testifies on Thursday. Thank you to our power panel this evening for sticking with us for so long. We really appreciate your time and your insights, as always. Thanks to Shachi Curl, Corey Tonight, Tim Murphy, and Françoise Boivin. Welcome back to Power and Politics. The Finance Committee just concluded 5 hours of pretty intense testimony. For 4 of those hours, Marc and Craig Kielburger, co-founders of We Charity, were in the hot seat, and early on they delivered this revelation.
But in the normal course of business, of course, when people do come to We Day, we also provide them with a reimbursement for their direct costs. So the information that we have readily available, to the best of our knowledge, sir, is Sacha Trudeau or Alexander Trudeau came to 8 We Days over a span of 2 years, and the average expenses was $2,447
per event.
So came to a total of 28 We Days over a span of 5 years, specifically speaking on the issue of mental health, from 2016 to 2020, including groups like We Day in the United Kingdom, which of course had an impact on the costs. The average expense there was $5,998. Sophie Trudeau came to a total of 7 We Days over a span of 3 years, and the average expense was $3,618.
So when you do all the math, that equals to more than $212,000 of reimbursed expenses. That's on top of the more than $282,000 paid to Margaret Trudeau, Alexandra Trudeau, and Sophie Gregoire Trudeau in speaking fees. To dig into that revelation and a whole lot more, we're joined now by Kevin Lamoureux. He's the parliamentary secretary to the government House Leader, as well as Michael Cooper, Conservative Deputy Finance Critic, and Charlie Angus, the NDP's ethics critic. Hi to all three of you. Thanks for making time. I know it's been a long afternoon, especially for Mr. Angus and Mr. Cooper. I'm sure for you as well, Mr. Lamoureux. I say that only because we just watched them for the past 5 hours in committee. I will begin with you, Mr. Lamoureux, in part on what we just played and that new information. I understand that it's reimbursement for expenses, but it is a new figure. More money that we now know went from We Charity to members of Justin Trudeau's family. We also learned that except for one payment to Sophie Gregoire Trudeau prior to 2015, all of this money went towards these family members since the Prime Minister became Prime Minister. Does that not add to the appearance of a real conflict of interest here?
I think what's really important is that we recognize that at the end of the day, the public service is the one that actually recommended we to the government. And yes, I would acknowledge right up front, there was a mistake. That was made by the Prime Minister, and he's talked about that, and he's apologized for that. And we now have the Ethics Commissioner looking into it. You just yourself commented about this lengthy process at the Finance Committee. There is an opportunity for us to look into the matter. What I have understand is that it's a very highly politically charged committee. And I've said on numerous occasions, whether it's to my constituents or others, that I have a great deal of confidence in the independent office of the Ethics Commissioner, which will come forward with the report. Remember, this is all about students. From virtually
I'm just going to interrupt you for a second, Mr. Lamoureux. Mr. Lamoureux,
sure.
with great respect, Mike, I understand all the points you're making, but they don't really speak directly to my question. We learn new information right now about the timing and the amount of money that members of the Prime Minister's family were in receipt of from a charity that was awarded essentially $43.5 million to administer a $500 million program. I'm wondering, from your perspective, as a member of this government, does that not add to the appearance of conflict of interest that we've heard from so many Canadians they're worried about?
Yeah. For me, as an individual, what I believe that most people, in particular the public service, would be aware of is that there was arrangements between the Trudeau families in terms of speaking in the past, that there's nothing that was trying to be hidden here. There is no hidden agenda. I think that it's been very transparent, whether it's we organization, the public service, opposition members. I'm sure that everyone was aware that there have been special engagements with not only members from the Trudeau family, but many other speakers, no doubt, that have been involved with we. And for me personally, I just don't want to lose the focus in terms of what it is that we should really be talking about. And that is what it is that we attempted to put together a suite of activities to support young people and youth. And this is just one component of it. There was nothing that was planned and trying to cover up something. This has been completely transparent. I don't think anyone would be surprised. Maybe some of the details when you look into some of the details. And that's why I say let's let the Ethics Commissioner do what it is that his office is best equipped to do it. And his motivation is completely different than an opposition party. I sat in opposition.
Yeah,
I understand what opposition wants, right? At the end of the day, Canadians will have the opportunity through the independent office of the parliamentary, of the House of Commons.
Yeah, I get that. I think it's a bit much to ask Canadians to stop asking questions while the Ethics Commissioner does his work. I have all the respect in the world for that work as well. We've seen the outcome of previous investigations, but I think there are still some valid questions to be asked in the interim. And I'll circle back to you, Mr. Lamoureux, but I do want to move on to Mr. Cooper, because what I did think that the Kielburger brothers effectively made a point of getting across today was that they did, and you may disagree, but they did not stand to benefit from this agreement, that it wasn't as though they were pocketing $43 million. They were essentially getting that money reimbursed from the government, that basically this was not like, we're friends with the Liberals, here's your $43 million, go and have a payday. Does that take away from the argument that your party is trying to put forward around this basically being a reward for a cozy friendship with the Liberals?
I don't think that they established that, Vashi, in their testimony today. When they were asked some fairly straightforward questions around salaries, they were completely evasive. They refused to answer the question. But with respect to the revelations today of hundreds of thousands of dollars that went into the pockets of the Prime Minister's immediate family, his mother and his brother, in the range of almost $500,000, that really should shock Canadians. But I guess for this Prime Minister, it's par for the course. He believes that there's one set of rules for himself and his family, and then another set of rules for everyone else. It underscores why he should have recused himself, and his failure to do so is problematic.
To be
with
fair,
respect to Bill Morneau,
to be fair, very quickly though, that money was for expenses. We learned today it was reimbursement for expenses. The speaking fees were revealed earlier.
Fees, expenses, hundreds of thousands of dollars, many times more than the vast majority of Canadians make, not just in a year, but in several years, paid to the Trudeau family. And just by coincidence, all but a very small amount after Justin Trudeau took office, after suddenly money was being pumped out of the federal government in the way of grants to the WE organization that led to this $500 million contribution to WE. With respect to the finance minister, in terms of his likely contraventions of the Conflict of Interest Act, there was more evidence established today. The Kielburgers were asked whether or not there had been any bill presented to the finance minister. They said no. They confirmed what they said in their media release, that it was all intended to be complimentary, and so therefore it appears the finance minister at the very least was willfully blind. And there are also some questions now about whether or not at least Bill Morneau's wife and daughter used private aircraft, which would again be a clear-cut contravention of the Conflict of Interest Act. And that's just on conflict of interest. There's a whole lot of questions about how in the world this organization got this agreement and the circumstances surrounding it, none of which were clarified today.
I want to pick up on that with Mr. Angus, because there were a number of questions directed to the Kielburger brothers around how this all came about. They seem to reiterate what they've said in the past, which is that it was the public service reaching out to them and they provided some options. And again, on the point that they really, I think, repeated over and over again, it's not like they were running away with the $43 million. Did that satisfy your concerns around if they stood to benefit, or to what degree?
Well, Vashi, I think we should put it in context with our first witness, Michelle Douglas, who was the former chair of the board, a very, very impressive woman who had deep faith in the WE organization for years, who said that in March, there's mass layoffs. This is a group that is facing serious financial crisis. She starts asking questions. The board's asking questions. We're told about a conversation where I asked if Marc Kielburger hung up on her. She said, well, the conversation ended abruptly. Then Craig Kielburger called her and said he wanted her resignation. So this was a group that was very much in trouble. They portrayed this as though that government came to them. You know, they just didn't have any idea, though. They were going to get themselves in this big schlemazel. They never would have picked up the phone. But we're also told that they were, right after this crisis that they had with the board, they were promoting a proposal. So they were reaching out. So where it gets complicated, and this is why we're having this discussion, is about the conflict of interest. They aren't registered to lobby, yet they're engaged with all manner of ministers. So that's a question. But what we found out today that I thought was really surprising, because we've been told time and time again, and, you know, Margaret Trudeau's been an inspiration for many people, but she gets hired and the brother gets hired after Justin Trudeau becomes prime minister, and then they said it wasn't for speaking fees, and certainly the board chair was Yeah, it was the ancillary events. It's the after show. It's the smooching. It's the meeting with all the big corporate donors who are coming in. So they're creating a situation where you have access to meet the Trudeau family. That puts the Prime Minister and that puts this government in a serious conflict. And that's something we didn't know before. If the after show with the corporate sponsors, the Trudeau name means a lot. And again, in terms of the speaking fees, the board chair was shocked that fees were paid to the Trudeau. So there's certainly that name and that access. So the question of access to corporate interest to the Prime Minister certainly raises the question of conflict of interest, and their failure to register as lobbyists adds more questions.
Something they say that they are reviewing, but I imagine those will all inform the questions that both of you and others will put forward to the Prime Minister on Thursday. I'm unfortunately out of time, but I want to thank all three of you for the discussion this evening. Thanks so much to Kevin Lamoureux, Michael Cooper, and Charlie Angus. Appreciate your time very much, gentlemen.
Take care.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Power and Politics. On this Tuesday evening, I'm Vashi Capellos. We Charity co-founders Craig and Marc Kielburger appeared before the House of Commons Finance Committee for 4 hours. Craig said the charity had agreed to administer the government student grant program to, quote, make a difference, not because the charity was in bad financial health. Take a listen.
Some have suggested that We Charity was in dire financial straits prior to the CSSG and that somehow motivated our actions. It simply isn't true, because, like many Canadian nonprofits and businesses, we had already taken difficult actions to adjust staff numbers and to pivot our programs to the new realities of COVID, as you heard a moment ago.
Also appearing before the committee today was the former chair of We Charity's board of directors, Michelle Douglas. She said that she resigned in part back in March of 2020 because of the lack of financial disclosure during what she called mass layoffs. She also said the board was denied access to the chief financial officer. To give us more insight on these revelations, we've reached Kate Bain. She's the managing director of Charity Intelligence Canada. She joins us from Toronto. Hi, Ms. Bain. Good to see you. Thank you for making time for us this evening.
You're welcome.
I want to preface our conversation, and we'll get into it a bit later, but your name, and in particular your organization's name, was actually mentioned during this testimony by the Kielburgers. They seem to dispute some of the things that you've said, so I'll ask you about that in a second. But I actually wanted to start off with that testimony from Michelle Douglas, in particular about why she resigned, and if any of that raised some red flags for you. When she said that, for example, the board was asking for access to financials to back up the claim that the executive team needed to fire a number of, or lay off a number of employees, hundreds, she said. She was never provided that information. What did that tell you?
And I think Charlie Angus really hammered on that point. It was so fascinating. It's about the accountability. It's great to be a co-founder. You have a board of directors who have the legal and fiduciary responsibility to oversee and govern a charity. And the board of directors weren't getting the correct information for what the charity actions were. So obviously, Michelle Douglas understood her responsibilities for oversight. She understood her responsibilities in governing, and yet to be able to do her job, she was, I think the word was, in the dark, kept in the dark, where the directors weren't informed. So in light of this, from what we heard in the testimony, the co-founders asked her to resign. We've received, 5 emails today from people saying, is that legal? Because in every other charity in Canada, it is the board of directors that are the quote-unquote boss. And there's this, I think Elizabeth May touched on, this founder role is murky.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to pick up on, because I too have been receiving notes from other people in charities who said that kind of thing is very rare. And I want to present that also, that to be fair, the Kielburgers said that her characterization they didn't necessarily agree with, that they had already started the process of figuring out new board members in 2019. They said it was well planned, the changes were well planned, but not very well executed. She made the very specific contentions about the information that was withheld. Can you just sort of, I guess, explain for viewers who aren't familiar with charities the significance of the board, and is that really a very unique thing? Like, as I said, I'm getting all these messages from people in charities who said that would not happen at my charity.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think everything about we is very unique. And I think, I mean, even when you're looking at companies or, shareholder companies, public companies, charities are public organizations. And where's the accountability? The accountability is always with the directors. Like, that's just the way that the structures are. And that's where the legal responsibility is. So, yes, that was one of our questions. And if we had had the chance to ask Craig and Marc questions, that was one of the areas that we wanted to probe on, was about were there control mechanisms by the co-founders over the directors, which would be, highly unusual.
You've also presented in previous interviews and with various outlets some assessment of the strength of their financials, which they disputed, as I mentioned, during the testimony today. They said some of the information that you've put forward is inaccurate. From your perspective, what is your assessment of their financials? And just I'll contextualize it for our viewers. Obviously, there is a lot of concern about the decision of the government to enter into the agreement with this charity, if it in fact was, not of good financial health and maybe needed the money, or, there's lots of political insinuations being made. I just wanted to ask you from an apolitical perspective what your assessment of those financials is.
Okay, let's stick with the facts. I've analyzed charities' audited financial statements since 2004. I am a certified financial analyst. In all my years, I have never seen in the audited financial statements of a charity a note from the auditor that a charity is in breach of its loan covenants. So that's rare. And to be in breach of your loan covenants for whatever reason, and we wrote that on our report on We Charity last July in 2019, because that is material information donors would need to know to make an informed giving decision. So in so this year, when we received the most recent audited financial statements, you automatically flip to the last chapter and you want to see, have they resolved this workout? Was it because of a fiscal year-end change? Was it because they only had 8 months in 2018? No, it was still there. Second year in a row, the auditor reported We Charity was in breach of its of its loan covenants. So that's their audited financial statements, and their auditor felt it was material to put into the audited financial statements.
Based on what you listened to today, Ms. Bain, I've only got about a minute left, but I'm wondering, as you look ahead on this issue, is there one outstanding question based on the information that you listened to today that still remains for you?
To me, the big thing today was about the board governance. The Finance Committee looked at the complexity. There were a lot of concerns about that. They looked at the limited liability with the We Charity Foundation having no assets, and talked to Craig and Marc about that. Why was the deal structured that way? That would put Canadian taxpayers at risk, or the government at risk in this case, if the deal was weak. And the board governance, the accountability. So those were sort of the key areas that the Finance Committee was going at.
Okay, I'll leave it there. I appreciate your analysis, Ms. Bain. Pleasure to have you with us this evening.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.